3 minutes. That's how long Marcus Sterling had before his BMW exploded into flames. The 24-year-old waitress running toward the wreckage had no idea she was about to save a billionaire's life, or that he would make her his business partner 2 weeks later. Keisha Davis dropped everything when she heard the crash outside Sterling Supper Club. The Lower East Side had been battling a storm all evening. Rain hammered the narrow streets, turning them into rivers that reflected the neon signs of late-night bodegas and all-night laundromats. Keisha had just finished her double shift, counting her tips in the empty restaurant. $43.60 for 14 hours of work. Her manager, Carl, had left hours ago as usual, dumping the closing duties on her while he disappeared into the night. The sound of crushing metal cut through the thunder like a scream. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw it immediately. A black BMW, expensive and sleek, wrapped around the concrete traffic barrier like a broken toy. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, mixing with the rain to create ghostly wisps in the streetlight. The driver's side was compressed against the barrier, and she could smell gasoline even from inside the restaurant. Keisha didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and sprinted toward the door, her sneakers sliding on the wet tile. The emergency training from her brief nursing school stint kicked in automatically. Check for consciousness. Assess breathing, control bleeding. She'd only completed 1 year before the money ran out, but those lessons had drilled themselves into her muscle memory. The scene outside was worse than it looked from the window. The BMW's front end was completely destroyed, the engine block pushed back toward the passenger compartment. Glass sparkled across the asphalt like deadly confetti. The driver was slumped forward against the steering wheel, motionless, a thin line of blood trailing from his forehead down to his expensive white shirt. She could hear the engine ticking as it cooled, but underneath that sound was something more dangerous, a faint hissing that made her stomach clench. Gas leak. The smell was getting stronger. "Sir!" she called, pulling at the driver's door. It was jammed, the frame bent beyond recognition. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. The man appeared to be in his 50s, well-groomed even in unconsciousness. His suit probably cost more than she made in 3 months. A Rolex caught the streetlight on his wrist, and his shoes were the kind of Italian leather that she'd only seen in magazine advertisements. She dialed 911 while circling to the passenger side, her free hand already assessing the damage. "There's been a severe car accident on Delancey Street, near the Sterling Supper Club. 1 victim, unconscious, possible head trauma. I can smell gasoline and the engine is smoking." The passenger door opened with a grinding protest. She crawled inside, glass crunching under her knees, and placed 2 fingers against the man's neck. Pulse, weak but steady. His breathing was shallow, and when she lifted his eyelid, his pupils were unequal. Concussion, definitely. Maybe worse. The hissing sound was getting louder. She tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but the mechanism was jammed. The steering wheel had pinned him in place, and she could see that moving him improperly could cause spinal damage. But staying here meant they both died when the engine caught fire. In the distance, she could hear sirens, but they sounded impossibly far away. The storm was slowing emergency response times, and this part of the Lower East Side wasn't exactly a priority for rapid service. She had maybe 2 minutes before the gasoline vapors found an ignition source. "Come on," she whispered, working at the seatbelt with desperate fingers. "Don't you die on me." The metal was warm to the touch, too warm. Time was running out. Keisha Davis had learned early that waiting for help meant waiting forever. At 24, she'd already buried a father who couldn't afford proper medical care, watched a mother struggle with diabetes while rationing insulin, and seen enough dreams die from lack of opportunity to know that survival meant self-reliance. This wasn't her first emergency. Growing up in public housing had taught her to react fast and think later. When Mrs. Rodriguez had her heart attack in the stairwell, it was Keisha who performed CPR until the paramedics arrived 23 minutes later. When the teenager next door overdosed on fentanyl-laced pills, she was the one who administered Narcan and kept him breathing. The neighborhood had learned to call her before they called 911, not because she was a hero, but because she showed up. The seatbelt finally gave way with a metallic snap. She could feel the heat from the engine bay now, and the chemical smell of burning plastic joined the gasoline vapors in the air. Moving him was a risk, but staying was suicide. "I'm sorry," she told the unconscious man as she prepared to drag him from the wreckage. "This is going to hurt." She'd learned the fireman's carry during her nursing program, the same program she'd abandoned when her mother's medical bills consumed her savings. 1 year at Borough of Manhattan Community College, studying to become a registered nurse. She'd loved it. The anatomy classes, the patient care rotations, the feeling that she was building towards something meaningful. But love didn't pay rent. When her mother's diabetes complications required emergency surgery, Keisha had withdrawn from school to work 3 jobs, waitressing at Sterling Supper Club, delivering food for an app-based service, and cleaning offices in Midtown. 60-hour weeks that left her exhausted, but kept the lights on and the medication flowing. The man was heavier than he looked, dead weight in expensive fabric. She managed to get him out of the car and onto the wet pavement, just as the first flames licked up from the engine compartment. Her back screamed in protest, and her knees were cut from the broken glass, but they were both clear of the immediate danger zone. She positioned him in the recovery position, on his side airway clear, and used her jacket to apply pressure to the head wound. The blood wasn't arterial, which was good, but head injuries were unpredictable. He needed a CT scan and probably surgery. The sirens were getting closer now, their wail echoing off the narrow buildings of the Lower East Side. Red and blue lights began to paint the wet streets, and she felt the familiar mixture of relief and disappointment that came with official help arriving just after the crisis had passed. This was her life in microcosm, always the first responder, never the recipient. She'd saved 3 people in as many years, but when her own father had collapsed at his construction job, he'd waited 47 minutes for an ambulance that arrived too late. When her mother needed insulin, there were no angels appearing with briefcases full of medicine. When Keisha herself needed help paying for school, the only response was a form letter, explaining that she didn't qualify for additional aid. But she'd stopped keeping score years ago. Helping people wasn't about fairness or reciprocity. It was about being the person she'd needed when her own world was falling apart. The fire department arrived first, followed by 2 paramedic units and a police car. She stepped back as the professionals took over, watching them stabilize the man she'd pulled from the wreckage. He was already being loaded onto a stretcher, IV lines being established, oxygen mask covering his face. "Good work," one of the paramedics told her as they wheeled him toward the ambulance. "You probably saved his life." Keisha nodded and walked back toward the restaurant, her jacket gone, her uniform soaked, her tips scattered somewhere in the chaos. Tomorrow she'd have to explain to Carl why she'd left her post, why the restaurant had been abandoned during closing duties. But tonight, someone was alive who might have died. In her world, that counted as a victory. The next morning brought new problems. Carl Martinez stood behind the Sterling Supper Club's bar with his arms crossed, his thin mustache twitching with barely contained anger. He'd been the manager for 3 years, and in that time, he'd perfected the art of making other people responsible for his failures. "You abandoned your post," he said without preamble as Keisha arrived for her morning shift. "Left the restaurant unlocked. Anyone could have walked in." Keisha tied her apron around her waist, fighting the urge to mention that the only thing worth stealing in the Sterling was the grease trap. "I saved someone's life, Carl. There was a car accident right outside. Not your job. Your job is tables and tips, not playing paramedic." She'd worked for men like Carl before, small tyrants who wielded what little power they had like medieval kings. He made scheduling decisions based on personal grudges, skimmed tips when he thought no one was looking, and had a creative relationship with labor laws that would have made any employment attorney salivate. But jobs were scarce in the neighborhood, and the Sterling paid better than most when Carl didn't find reasons to dock their pay. "It won't happen again," she said, knowing it was a lie. She'd do the same thing tomorrow if she had to. The rest of the morning shift passed in tense silence. Keisha handled her usual section, the 8 tables by the windows, while Carl retreated to his office to do whatever managers did when they weren't actively making everyone else miserable. The Sterling Supper Club wasn't much to look at. Faded burgundy walls, mismatched chairs, and a sound system that crackled when the subway passed underneath. But it had been serving the neighborhood for 23 years, and the food was honest even if the management wasn't. It was during the lunch rush that she first noticed the discrepancies. Mrs. Chen from the Seniors Center called to confirm the catering order for Thursday. 75 box lunches at $12 each. Keisha pulled out the order book to check the details, but the carbon copy showed a different number. $15 per lunch. She flipped through more pages. The Patterson law firm had ordered breakfast pastries for a meeting. The client copy said $48, but the restaurant's record showed $64. The community college had booked a graduation reception for next month. Their quote, $1,800. The file copy, $2,400. Every corporate catering order had two prices, the higher amount always in Carl's handwriting. Keisha's stomach dropped as the pattern became clear. Carl wasn't just stealing tips. He was systematically overcharging corporate clients and pocketing the difference. The community organizations, the local businesses, the schools, they all paid what they'd agreed to. But the corporate accounts, the ones with expense accounts and accounts payable departments, they were being charged 30 to 40% more than quoted. She thought about the seniors center, stretching their budget to feed elderly residents. They paid $12 per lunch because that's all they could afford. But the law firm, which could easily absorb the extra cost, was being charged more so Carl could line his own pockets. Find something interesting? She spun around to see Carl standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. How long had he been watching her? Just checking Thursday's order, she said, closing the book casually. Mrs. Chen wanted to add vegetarian options. Carl's eyes narrowed. Order book stays behind the counter. Servers don't need to be looking through financial records. I was just trying to help. I'll decide what help I need. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the cigarettes on his breath. You've been making a lot of mistakes lately, Keisha. Leaving early, neglecting duties, now going through confidential paperwork. Maybe you're not as reliable as I thought. The threat was clear. Keep quiet or find another job. In the current economy, with her mother's medical bills and no college degree, another job might take months to find. But as she looked at the order book in Carl's hands, she thought about Mrs. Chen and the seniors who counted every dollar. She thought about the community college students who'd worked extra shifts to afford their graduation celebration. Some things were worth the risk. That night, Keisha stayed late again, but this time it was intentional. She waited until Carl left at 9. He always left early on Wednesdays, claiming he had management meetings that everyone knew meant poker games in the back room of Rodriguez's bar. The other staff filtered out gradually. Miguel the cook, Jenny the hostess, Marcus the busboy. By 10:30, she was alone with the restaurant's secrets. Carl's office was a disaster of stacked papers, empty coffee cups and ashtrays that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. But his filing system was surprisingly organized, probably because he needed to keep track of his fraud. The catering contracts were in a metal cabinet beside his desk, separated into current orders and completed jobs. She started with the current contracts. The pattern was worse than she'd thought. Every corporate client was being systematically overcharged, but the scheme was sophisticated. Carl would quote one price to the client, then submit a higher invoice through a separate billing company, Sterling Premium Catering Services. The clients dealing with bureaucratic accounts payable departments rarely noticed the difference between the company that gave the quote and the one that sent the bill. The completed files told an even more disturbing story. Over the past 6 months, Carl had stolen nearly $30,000 through the fake billing scheme. Money that should have gone to the restaurant, to the staff, to improving the food and equipment. Instead, it had funded Carl's lifestyle while the Sterling struggled with broken equipment and skeleton staffing. She photographed every suspicious document with her phone, being careful not to disrupt Carl's filing system. The evidence was overwhelming. Contract quotes in one handwriting, inflated invoices in another, a separate checking account for Sterling Premium Catering that Carl had opened using the restaurant's tax ID number. But as she documented Carl's crimes, she realized she was also collecting evidence against herself. How could she explain being in his office after hours, going through confidential files? Carl would claim she was trying to steal client information, or worse, that she was the one skimming money. Who would believe a waitress over a manager with 3 years on the job? She was putting the last file back when she heard the front door open. Her blood froze. Carl never came back after poker, but maybe tonight was different. Maybe someone had seen the lights on and called him. Maybe her luck had finally run out. Footsteps echoed through the empty dining room, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. She could hear them moving between the tables, chairs scraping against the floor as they navigated in the darkness. Keisha's phone was still in camera mode, the screen glowing like a beacon in the dark office. She quickly turned it off and crept toward the window that faced the alley. If she could get out without being seen, she could claim she'd forgotten something and come back tomorrow during normal hours. But the footsteps were getting closer, and the office door was between her and the emergency exit. She was trapped with a phone full of evidence that could either save the restaurant or destroy her career. The footsteps stopped right outside the office door. "I know someone's in there," a voice called. Not Carl's voice. This was older, more refined, with an accent that suggested private schools and country clubs. "The lights were on when I drove by. This is private property after hours." Keisha's mind raced. A customer? A health inspector? Police? None of those options were good for a young black woman caught breaking into her manager's office, even if she was technically an employee with legitimate concerns. "I'm calling the police," the voice continued. "You have 10 seconds to come out before this becomes a criminal matter." She had no choice. Better to face the consequences now than to hide and make everything worse. Keisha took a deep breath, opened the office door and stepped into the dining room with her hands visible. Standing by the front entrance, silhouetted against the streetlights, was a man in an expensive overcoat. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she recognized the face she'd last seen unconscious and bleeding. It was the man from the car accident. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus Sterling stood in the doorway of his own restaurant, though Keisha didn't know that yet, studying the young woman who had saved his life 2 weeks ago. She looked different in the dim light of the dining room, smaller, more vulnerable, but with the same determined expression he remembered from the rain-soaked street. "You're the waitress," he said finally, "from the accident." Keisha nodded, her throat too dry for words. She'd replayed that night a dozen times, wondering if the man had survived, if her amateur medical intervention had been enough. Seeing him here walking and talking and clearly recovered should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like walking into a trap. "What are you doing here after hours?" His voice was calm but firm, the tone of someone accustomed to getting straight answers. She could lie, claim she'd forgotten her keys or her phone or some other innocent reason for being in the restaurant at 11 p.m. But the evidence was already on her phone, and something about his direct gaze made deception feel impossible. "I was investigating financial irregularities," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "My manager has been systematically overcharging corporate clients and pocketing the difference." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime." She pulled out her phone, scrolling to the photos she'd taken. $30,000 over 6 months. Fake billing company, inflated invoices, separate bank account. He's been stealing from every corporate client we serve. She held out the phone, showing him the side-by-side images of quotes and invoices. Marcus moved closer, studying the evidence with the intense focus of someone who understood financial documents. His expression grew darker with each image. "Sterling Premium Catering Services," he read aloud. "Clever. Most accounts payable departments wouldn't notice the difference." He looked up at her. "How long have you known?" "I started noticing discrepancies this week. Tonight was the first time I could access the files." She hesitated, then added, "I know I shouldn't have been in his office without permission, but the community organizations we serve, they're getting cheated by association. When clients find out about the fake billing, it's going to destroy the restaurant's reputation." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Keisha found herself studying his face in the light from the street. The bandage on his forehead had been removed, leaving only a thin red line where the glass had cut him. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes probably cost more than her monthly rent, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. But there was something else in his expression, a weight that suggested he understood the consequences of corruption more personally than his appearance might suggest. "You said community organizations," he said finally. "Which ones?" "The Seniors Center, the community college, the after-school program at PS 147. They negotiate prices down to what they can afford, then pay exactly what they agreed to. But when the corporate clients find out they're being overcharged, they'll assume the whole restaurant is corrupt. And you're worried about the community losing access to affordable catering. I'm worried about good people getting blamed for one man's greed." She locked her phone and put it back in her pocket. "Those organizations depend on this place. If we lose our reputation, they lose their most reliable food service." Marcus nodded slowly. "You risked your job to protect clients you've never met." "I risked my job to protect the truth." She met his gaze directly. Some things are more important than keeping a steady paycheck. Even when that paycheck is all that stands between you and poverty? The question hit closer to home than she liked to admit. Especially then. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "What's your name?" "Keisha Davis." "Well, Keisha Davis," he said, extending his hand. "I think we need to talk." Marcus Sterling had built his fortune on a simple principle. The difference between right and wrong was never complicated, only expensive. Standing in the dim restaurant, looking at a waitress who had risked everything to expose corruption, he was reminded of why he'd started Sterling Enterprises in the first place. "Do you know who I am?" he asked as they sat across from each other at one of the window tables. Keisha shook her head. "Someone who can afford a BMW and custom suits. Someone who probably doesn't usually eat at places like this." He smiled at her honesty. "Marcus Sterling. I'm the CEO of Sterling Enterprises and I own this building." The color drained from Keisha's face. "You're my landlord." "Technically, yes. Though I prefer to think of myself as an investor in community development." He leaned back in his chair, studying her reaction. "I bought this building 3 years ago as part of a neighborhood revitalization project. The plan was to improve the properties while keeping rents affordable for local businesses. And now you've caught one of your tenants committing fraud." Her voice was flat, defeated. "I suppose you'll want to terminate our lease immediately. Actually, I'm more interested in understanding how this happened under my watch." Marcus pulled out his own phone and scrolled through contacts. "I receive quarterly reports on all my properties, including financial performance metrics. The Sterling Supper Club has been consistently underperforming compared to similar establishments." He showed her a spreadsheet on his screen. "Revenue should be about 40% higher based on location and capacity. I assumed it was poor management or market conditions, but now I'm wondering if your manager has been hiding income from the legitimate business while skimming money through his fake catering company." Keisha studied the numbers, her expression thoughtful. "That would explain why we're always short-staffed and the equipment never gets repaired. If Carl's stealing a third of the revenue, there's no money left for actual operations, which creates a downward spiral. Poor service drives away customers, which makes the legitimate business even less profitable, which provides more cover for the fraud." Marcus put his phone away. "It's actually quite sophisticated for a small-time operation. Carl's not as stupid as he looks." She paused, then added, "Though he's definitely stupider than he thinks." Marcus laughed, despite himself. "You saved my life 2 weeks ago, and now you're trying to save my investment. Do you make a habit of rescuing things?" "I make a habit of doing what's right." Keisha's voice carried an edge of defensiveness. "Though it doesn't always work out well for me." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty had gotten her this far. "I was in nursing school before this, had to drop out when my mother got sick and the medical bills started piling up. Took this job to pay for her insulin and keep the lights on. You wanted to be a nurse, still do, but wanting and affording are different things." She gestured around the restaurant. "This place isn't my dream job, but it's steady work in a neighborhood where steady work is hard to find. When Carl gets fired, and he will get fired, there's no guarantee his replacement will keep me on. New managers like to hire their own people." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Here was someone who had sacrificed her own education to care for family, who had risked her job to expose corruption, who had literally saved his life without expecting anything in return. In his world of corporate politics and calculated relationships, her straightforward integrity was almost shocking. "What if I told you there was another option?" he said finally. "What kind of option? What if instead of hiring a new manager, I found a new partner?" Keisha stared at him. "I don't understand. This restaurant is failing because it's being run by someone who sees it as a personal piggy bank instead of a community asset. But you see its potential. You understand the neighborhood, you care about the clients, and you're willing to fight for what's right even when it costs you. Are you offering me Carl's job? I'm offering you something better than that. If this story of courage and justice resonates with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Keisha's situation?" "I'm offering you a partnership," Marcus said, his words hanging in the air between them like a challenge. "Not just this restaurant, but something bigger, a model for what community-focused food service could look like." Keisha felt like the world had tilted sideways. You don't know anything about me except that I'm a waitress who calls out fraud when I see it. I know you saved my life without hesitation. I know you risked your job to protect people you've never met. I know you dropped out of nursing school to care for your mother, which shows both sacrifice and responsibility. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intent. And I know that in 15 minutes of conversation, you've shown more genuine business insight than most of the MBAs I work with. Business insight? Keisha almost laughed. I serve tables and take orders. You identified a complex fraud scheme, documented evidence systematically, and understood immediately how the corruption would impact community relationships. You analyzed financial patterns and predicted market consequences. He gestured around the restaurant. And you did it all while working 3 jobs to support a family member with chronic illness. That's not service industry experience. That's executive-level problem-solving under pressure. Keisha wanted to argue, but something in his tone made her pause. She'd never thought about her daily survival skills as business qualifications, but when he put it that way, what exactly are you proposing? Sterling Community Kitchens, a network of restaurants designed specifically to serve both profitable corporate clients and affordable community needs. We take the lessons learned here. What works, what doesn't, what the neighborhood actually needs, and we scale it. He pulled out a tablet and showed her a presentation that looked like it had been prepared by a consulting firm. I've been working on this concept for months, but I needed someone with real operational experience. Someone who understands both the business side and the community side. The slides showed financial projections, market analysis, and architectural renderings of restaurants that looked nothing like the Sterling Supper Club. These were bright modern spaces, with open kitchens and flexible seating arrangements. But underneath the sleek surfaces, she could see the same basic idea that had drawn her to the Sterling. Good food at fair prices, serving people who actually lived in the neighborhood. You've been planning this for months. The concept, yes, but not the partnership. Marcus closed the tablet and looked at her directly. I was going to hire a management company and treat it like any other investment. Professional, but distant. Then I got a close look at what happens when someone cares more about profit than purpose. Carl, and frankly myself for the past 3 years. I bought this building with good intentions, but I didn't pay attention to how it was actually being run. I treated it like a passive investment instead of a community responsibility. He paused. You saved my life. But more than that, you reminded me why I got into community development in the first place. Keisha studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or condescension. Rich men didn't usually offer partnerships to waitresses they'd known for 20 minutes, but his expression was serious, almost vulnerable, like someone making a confession rather than a sales pitch. Why me? She asked finally. You could hire any restaurant consultant in the city, people with actual experience running businesses. Because consultants optimize for profit, you optimize for people. Marcus gestured toward her phone, where the evidence of Carl's fraud was still stored. You didn't expose the billing scheme because it was hurting the restaurant's bottom line. You did it because it was hurting the community college kids and the seniors who count every dollar. That's basic decency, not business strategy. In my experience, those are the same thing. The businesses that survive long-term are the ones that serve their communities instead of exploiting them. Everything else is just quarterly earnings manipulation. Keisha felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Not just the possibility of a better job, but the possibility of work that aligned with her values instead of fighting against them. But possibility and reality were different things, and she'd learned to be suspicious of promises that sounded too good to be true. What's the catch? Marcus smiled at her skepticism. The catch is that this would be the hardest thing you've ever done. Running one restaurant is exhausting. Building a chain of community-focused restaurants while maintaining quality and affordability. That's borderline impossible. And you think I can do borderline impossible? I think we can do it together. Your community insight combined with my capital and business infrastructure. He paused. But I won't lie to you. The failure rate for restaurant startups is over 80%. Even with unlimited funding, most new concepts fail within 2 years. Keisha appreciated his honesty more than any sales pitch. What would my role be exactly? Equal partner, 50-50 ownership of Sterling Community Kitchens. You'd oversee all operations, hiring, training, menu development, community outreach. I'd handle the financial side, legal compliance, real estate acquisition, and strategic planning. Marcus pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. That's my lawyer's direct number. She'll walk you through exactly what the partnership agreement would look like. You're serious about this? Dead serious. But I need you to understand what you'd be giving up. His expression grew more serious. Steady paycheck, predictable hours, the safety of working for someone else. As a partner, your income would depend entirely on the success of the business. Some months you might make more than you've ever dreamed. Other months you might make nothing. Keisha thought about her current situation. 3 jobs that barely covered her mother's medical expenses, no health insurance, no savings, no prospects for advancement. The stability Marcus was describing was more theoretical than real. How long do I have to decide? Take as much time as you need, but I'd like to start the legal process of removing your current manager within the week. Marcus stood and put on his overcoat. The fraud needs to stop immediately, regardless of what you decide about the partnership. What happens to Carl? That depends on how cooperative he is. If he returns the stolen money and resigns quietly, we might avoid criminal charges. If he fights it, Marcus shrugged. Financial fraud is a federal crime. The FBI tends to take a dim view of people who steal from community organizations. Keisha felt a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Carl had earned whatever consequences came his way, but his downfall would probably mean chaos for the remaining staff. What about the other employees? They keep their jobs, with raises to reflect the restaurant's actual revenue instead of Carl's skimmed version. And if you agree to the partnership, they'd be among the first hires for the new concept. It was a generous offer, almost too generous. But as Marcus gathered his things to leave, Keisha realized something that surprised her. She trusted him. Not because he was rich or charming, but because he'd shown up at midnight to check on a property personally, instead of sending security. Because he'd listened to her concerns about community impact instead of just focusing on profit loss. Because he'd offered her real partnership instead of just a better job. "Marcus," she called as he reached the door. "Why did you come here tonight? How did you even know about the lights being on?" He turned back with a slight smile. "I drive by this place every few weeks to check on the neighborhood development progress. Tonight I saw lights on after closing time and wanted to make sure everything was secure." He paused. "Call it fate. Call it coincidence. Call it whatever you want. But I'm glad I was here to witness someone fighting for what's right." After he left, Keisha sat alone in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the familiar smell of grease and old coffee. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Working late again, don't forget to eat something." She looked around the Sterling Supper Club. The faded walls, the mismatched chairs, the dreams deferred and compromises accepted. Then she thought about the presentation Marcus had shown her, the bright modern spaces where community and profit could coexist. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. The next morning brought chaos. Keisha arrived at the Sterling Supper Club to find Carl pacing behind the bar like a caged animal, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled from an obviously sleepless night. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed with something approaching panic. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing toward his office. "Now." Keisha followed him, her pulse quickening. Had Marcus already confronted him? Had Carl somehow discovered that she'd been in his files? The office looked the same as it had the night before, but Carl's nervous energy filled the small space like static electricity. "I got a call this morning," Carl said, closing the door behind them. "From Sterling Enterprises. They want to schedule a comprehensive business review of our operations." He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "You know anything about that?" "Should I?" Keisha kept her voice neutral, but her mind was racing. Marcus was moving faster than she'd expected. "Don't play dumb with me. You were the last one here last night, and now suddenly the property management company wants to audit our books." Carl took a long drag from his cigarette. "That's one hell of a coincidence. Maybe they do periodic reviews. This is a business property, right?" Carl studied her face, looking for tells. "They specifically mentioned financial irregularities. Now what do you suppose would make them use language like that?" Keisha felt her stomach clench, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I wouldn't know, I just serve tables." "Right, you just serve tables." Carl's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Except you've been asking a lot of questions lately about catering orders and billing procedures. Questions that servers don't usually ask. I was trying to help customers who had concerns about their orders." "Bullshit." Carl moved closer, close enough that she could smell the stale cigarettes and fear sweat on his clothes. "You've been snooping around, haven't you? Looking through files that are none of your business." Keisha realized this was the moment of truth. She could continue lying, hope that Marcus's investigation would proceed without her direct involvement, and probably keep her job until Carl was removed. Or she could stand up for what she knew was right and accept the consequences. She thought about Mrs. Chen at the senior center, carefully budgeting every meal to make sure the elderly residents had adequate nutrition. She thought about the community college students working double shifts to afford their graduation celebration, only to have their trust betrayed by inflated billing. "Yes," she said quietly. "I've been looking through files." Carl's face went white, then red. "You little—" "I found the Sterling Premium catering accounts," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "The fake invoices, the inflated billing, the separate bank account, all of it." For a moment, Carl looked like he might have a stroke. Then his expression shifted from panic to calculation. "You can't prove anything. And even if you could, who's going to believe a waitress over a manager with 3 years of clean employment records? Sterling Enterprises will believe the documented evidence of systematic fraud." Keisha pulled out her phone. $30,000 over 6 months, Carl. That's federal crime territory." Carl stared at the phone like it was a loaded weapon. "What do you want?" "I want you to return the money you stole and resign immediately. Clean and simple. And if I don't? Then Marcus Sterling gets a full report of your criminal activity, along with photographic evidence and a detailed timeline." Keisha kept her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "Your choice." Carl was quiet for a long moment, his cigarette burning down to his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You have no idea what you're messing with. This isn't just about the restaurant." "What do you mean? You think I'm the only one? You think this is some small-time operation I cooked up by myself?" Carl laughed bitterly. "Sterling Premium Catering is connected to bigger things. People who don't like their business arrangements being disrupted by crusading waitresses." A chill ran down Keisha's spine. "Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. Take your self-righteous crusade and walk away while you still can. Find another job, keep your mouth shut, and pretend you never saw those files." "Or what?" Carl didn't answer directly. Instead, he stubbed out his cigarette and straightened his tie, suddenly looking more like the manager he was supposed to be. "The audit is scheduled for Friday. That gives you 3 days to think about whether exposing this fraud is really worth the consequences." He walked past her toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. "And Keisha? If I were you, I'd be very careful about who I trusted with this information. Sterling Enterprises is a big company, with a lot of moving parts. You never know who might have their own reasons for keeping certain arrangements quiet." After he left, Keisha sat in the empty office, her hands shaking as the full implications of Carl's words sank in. She'd thought she was dealing with a simple case of managerial theft, but apparently she'd stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Coffee at 2 p.m. We need to discuss next steps." She stared at the message, remembering Carl's warning about not knowing who to trust. Was Marcus really the ethical businessman he appeared to be, or was he somehow connected to the larger operation Carl had hinted at? But as she thought about the choice in front of her, she realized it didn't matter. Whether the conspiracy was small or large, whether the risks were minimal or severe, the fundamental question remained the same. Would she stand up for what was right, or would she let fear make her complicit in injustice? She typed back, "I'll be there." The coffee shop Marcus had chosen was a small independent place 6 blocks from the Sterling Supper Club, far enough to avoid curious eyes, close enough that Keisha could walk there during her break. She arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner table where she could watch the entrance, her nursing school training in situational awareness proving useful in ways she'd never expected. Marcus arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather messenger bag and wearing a different expensive suit that somehow managed to look more approachable than the one from the night before. He ordered 2 coffees without asking what she wanted, medium roast with cream, which happened to be exactly right, and settled into the chair across from her. You look like someone who didn't sleep well, he observed. Carl knows I found the files, she said without preamble. He also claims this is bigger than just his personal fraud scheme. Marcus's expression grew serious. What exactly did he say? Keisha recounted the morning's confrontation, watching Marcus's face for any signs of recognition or concern when she mentioned Carl's warnings about Sterling Enterprises having moving parts and arrangements. But his expression remained steady, focused like a doctor listening to symptoms. He's trying to scare you, Marcus said when she finished. It's a classic intimidation tactic. Make the victim think they're in over their head so they'll back down. But what if he's not lying? What if Sterling Premium Catering really is connected to something larger? Marcus pulled out his tablet and opened a financial analysis program. Let's find out, he typed rapidly, accessing databases that clearly required expensive subscriptions. Sterling Premium Catering Services, incorporated 6 months ago using the restaurant's tax ID number, single checking account at First National, sole authorized signatory Carl Martinez. He showed her the screen. Bank records show deposits totaling $32,000, all from corporate clients who were overbilled for catering services. Withdrawals are mostly cash, plus payments to Carl's personal credit cards and a few luxury purchases. Marcus scrolled through the transaction history. Unless Carl is running a very sophisticated money laundering operation through Best Buy and Mercedes-Benz, this looks like straightforward embezzlement. Keisha felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. So he was just trying to scare me. Probably, though. Marcus hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. There is something you should know about Sterling Enterprises. Here it comes, Keisha thought. The catch. The hidden agenda. The reason this all seemed too good to be true. We're not just a property management company, Marcus continued. Sterling Enterprises specializes in community development projects in underserved neighborhoods. We buy distressed properties, improve them, and lease them back to local businesses at below-market rates. That sounds actually good? It is good when it works correctly, but it also makes us a target for people who prefer neighborhoods to stay distressed. Marcus closed the tablet and leaned forward. Gentrification creates a lot of opportunities for corruption. Zoning variance approvals, building permit expediting, tax assessment negotiations. Every step of the development process involves public officials who can be influenced. Are you saying Sterling Enterprises bribes people? I'm saying Sterling Enterprises specifically doesn't bribe people, which puts us at a competitive disadvantage against companies that do. His voice carried a note of frustration. We pay fair wages, follow environmental regulations, maintain affordable rent structures, and somehow still manage to turn a profit. But we're constantly competing against developers who cut corners and buy influence. Keisha studied his face, looking for signs of deception. Why are you telling me this? Because if you're going to be my partner, you need to understand what you're signing up for. Building something ethical in an unethical industry isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. People with vested interests in maintaining the status quo don't appreciate disruption. What would you do in Keisha's position? Drop a like if you think she should trust Marcus, and let me know in the comments what red flags you'd be watching for. Is that what happened to Carl? Did someone pressure him to steal money? I don't think so. His fraud was too amateur, too personal. This looks like basic greed rather than sophisticated corruption. Marcus paused. But his warning about bigger consequences? That might be real. If we move forward with Sterling Community Kitchens, we'll be creating a model that threatens a lot of established interests. What kind of threats are we talking about? Regulatory harassment? Permit delays? Health inspection problems that somehow disappear when you hire the right consulting company? Nothing illegal enough to prosecute, but enough to make operating a business nearly impossible. Marcus met her eyes directly. I want to be completely honest with you, Keisha. This partnership could change your life in amazing ways, but it could also make you enemies you didn't know existed. Keisha thought about her conversation with Carl, his obvious fear, his desperate attempt to convince her to walk away. Then she thought about Mrs. Chen and the Seniors Center, about the community college students who deserved honest service for their hard-earned money. The communities we'd be serving, she said slowly, they're already being exploited by people who see their poverty as an opportunity. At least this way, they'd have somewhere that actually cared about them. Exactly. Marcus smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. The question is whether you're willing to fight for that. Keisha looked around the coffee shop, taking in the mismatched furniture, the local art on the walls, the owner working behind the counter because she couldn't afford to hire additional staff. This was the kind of business that Sterling Community Kitchens could support and protect, or the kind that would be driven out by developers who valued profit over people. "I'm willing to fight," she said, "but I need to know that I'm fighting alongside someone I can trust. Ask me anything. Why me, really? You could have your pick of experienced restaurant managers, people with business degrees and industry connections. Why offer a partnership to someone you met during a medical emergency?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Because in 30 years of business, I've learned to recognize something rare: moral courage under pressure. When you exposed Carl's fraud, you weren't thinking about career advancement or personal gain. You were thinking about justice for people who couldn't fight for themselves." He gestured toward the window, where the Lower East Side bustled with its mix of long-time residents and newcomers, struggling families and young professionals. "Building something that serves this community instead of exploiting it requires someone who sees the people, not just the profit margins. Someone who will make the right decision even when it costs them. And you think I'm that someone? I know you are. You proved it when you saved my life, and you proved it again when you risked your job to expose corruption." Marcus extended his hand across the table. "The question is whether you're ready to prove it on a bigger stage." Keisha looked at his outstretched hand, knowing that shaking it would change everything. No more working 3 jobs just to survive. No more choosing between her mother's medication and her own future. No more accepting scraps from people who saw her as disposable. But also no more safety net, no more predictable income, no more hiding in the background while other people made the important decisions. She reached out and shook his hand. "Let's build something worth fighting for." The handshake lasted only a moment, but Keisha felt the weight of it long after Marcus had left, to prepare for Carl's termination. She walked back to the Sterling Supper Club with her mind racing, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd just agreed to: partnership in a business she'd never managed, responsibility for communities she was only beginning to understand, a future that was either brilliantly promising or spectacularly risky. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the black sedan parked across from the restaurant. Almost, but not quite. The car was too clean for the neighborhood, too expensive, and the 2 men inside were watching the Sterling's entrance with the kind of focused attention that made her nursing school crisis training kick in. Keisha ducked into the bodega next door and pretended to browse the magazine rack while keeping an eye on the sedan. 5 minutes passed. 10. The men never moved, never checked phones, never did anything except watch her workplace with professional intensity. Carl's warning echoed in her mind. "You have no idea what you're messing with." She bought a pack of gum she didn't want and used the transaction as cover to call Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "There are 2 men watching the restaurant," she said quietly. "Black sedan, New York plates, been sitting there for at least 15 minutes. Are you safe where you are? For now. But I'm supposed to start my shift in 10 minutes. Stay where you are. I'm sending security." "Security?" Keisha's voice rose slightly. "What kind of security?" "The kind that deals with intimidation tactics by people who don't want their business arrangements disrupted." Marcus's voice was grim. "Carl made some calls after your conversation this morning. Apparently his fraud scheme had investors who aren't happy about potential exposure." Keisha's blood went cold. "Investors in restaurant theft?" "Investors in whatever Carl was doing with the stolen money. Money laundering, underground gambling, loan sharking. When $30,000 disappears into cash withdrawals, it usually funds something illegal." Marcus paused. "The good news is that these people are mainly interested in intimidation. They want to scare you into silence, not actually hurt you. And the bad news? The bad news is that intimidation can escalate quickly if they think their initial approach isn't working." Through the bodega window, Keisha watched one of the men get out of the sedan and walk toward the Sterling's entrance. He was large, well-dressed, and moved with the deliberate confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through physical presence. "One of them is going inside," she reported. "Perfect. That gives us everything we need for a criminal harassment complaint." Marcus's tone shifted to something more businesslike. "Are you recording this conversation?" "No. Should I be?" Start now. Document everything you see, and stay on the line with me until my people arrive. Keisha activated her phone's recording function and narrated what she observed. The man entering the restaurant, another figure joining him from the opposite direction, the way other pedestrians seemed to instinctively avoid the area around the sedan. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what am I getting myself into?" "Something important," he replied without hesitation. "These people exist because communities like yours have been abandoned by legitimate businesses. They fill the vacuum with exploitation and violence, and they survive because no one with resources is willing to fight them. And you think we can fight them? I think we can do something better than fight them. And we can make them irrelevant." His voice carried absolute conviction. When a neighborhood has legitimate businesses that serve the community fairly, the illegitimate operations lose their customer base. When people have alternatives, they don't have to accept exploitation. The man emerged from the Sterling looking frustrated. He spoke briefly to his partner, then both men got back in the sedan. But they didn't leave. If anything, their attention seemed more focused than before. "They're regrouping," Keisha observed, "which means Carl refused to cooperate with whatever they wanted him to do." Marcus sounded almost pleased. "Probably told them that you'd already documented everything and that silencing you wouldn't solve their problem. Is that true?" "It's true that silencing you wouldn't solve their problem. But it's not true that documentation alone is enough to protect you." Marcus's voice grew serious. "Keisha, I need you to understand something. If you walk away now, these people will probably leave you alone. Carl gets fired for standard embezzlement. They write off their losses, everybody moves on. But if you stay, you become someone worth targeting. Not just because of what you know about Carl, but because of what we're planning to build. Sterling Community Kitchens represents exactly the kind of legitimate competition that threatens their business model." Keisha watched the sedan, thinking about the choice in front of her. She could go back to serving tables, keeping her head down, accepting whatever scraps the world offered. Safe, predictable, small. Or she could step into something larger and more dangerous, something that might actually matter. "The security you're sending," she said finally, "are they the kind of people who solve problems with violence?" "They're the kind of people who solve problems with law enforcement connections and very good lawyers." Marcus's tone was dry. "I find that legal consequences tend to be more effective than physical ones." "Good. Because I didn't sign up to become a character in a crime movie. You signed up to serve communities that have been ignored and exploited. Unfortunately, that sometimes puts you in conflict with people who profit from ignoring and exploiting them." Keisha took a deep breath, watching the men in the sedan who were watching her workplace. "When does it get easier?" "When we win." Marcus's security team arrived in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable. Two unmarked cars positioned themselves at either end of the block, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid direct confrontation. A woman in a business suit walked into the bodega and bought coffee while speaking quietly into a wireless earpiece. Within minutes, the black sedan had disappeared, but Keisha noticed that the security presence remained. "Professional intimidation requires an audience," Marcus explained when he arrived 20 minutes later. "Once it becomes clear that the target is protected and the intimidation is being documented, most of these operations move on to easier targets." "Most of them?" "The smart ones. There's always a chance we're dealing with people who prioritize pride over pragmatism." He gestured toward the Sterling Supper Club, where the lunch rush was proceeding normally, despite the morning's drama. "But Carl's already been suspended pending investigation, and I've had a conversation with the bank about freezing the Sterling Premium Catering account." Keisha felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "How did he take the suspension?" "Better than expected. I think the intimidation visit scared him more than it scared you." Marcus smiled grimly. "He's agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for avoiding criminal charges." "And the money he stole?" "Full restitution plus penalties. The funds will be returned to the overcharged clients, and the remainder will go toward upgrading equipment and increasing staff wages." Marcus paused. "There's also enough left over to cover the first month's rent on our new location." "New location?" Keisha's eyebrows rose. "You're moving fast. I've been scouting properties for months. There's a space in Harlem that would be perfect for our first Sterling Community Kitchen. Former restaurant. Fully equipped, available immediately." Marcus pulled out his tablet and showed her photos of a bright modern space with large windows and an open kitchen design. 60 seats, commercial-grade equipment and rent that's 30% below market rate because the landlord believes in community development. The space was beautiful, exactly the kind of place Keisha had dreamed of working in, but never imagined she might own. It's perfect. But can we really make this work? Running a restaurant is hard enough without trying to balance profit and community service. That's exactly why it will work, Marcus replied. Most restaurants fail because they try to maximize short-term profits instead of building sustainable relationships. They cut quality to reduce costs, exploit workers to increase margins, and treat customers as transactions instead of community members. He scrolled to a financial projection that showed revenue streams from multiple sources: traditional dining, corporate catering, community events, and cooking classes. Sterling Community Kitchens will succeed because we're building an integrated business model. The profitable services subsidize the community services, and the community services create customer loyalty that drives the profitable services. It's a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious one. Exactly. And you'll be the CEO of the entire operation, starting with our Harlem location and expanding as we prove the concept. Marcus closed the tablet and looked at her directly. I want to be completely transparent about what this means. You'll be responsible for every aspect of operations: hiring, training, menu development, financial management, community outreach. I'll provide capital and strategic guidance, but the day-to-day success or failure will depend entirely on your leadership. Keisha felt a flutter of panic. I've never managed anything bigger than a single shift at the Sterling. You've never had the resources to manage anything bigger, but you've demonstrated every skill necessary for successful leadership: integrity under pressure, strategic thinking, community awareness, and the ability to inspire trust in people who have every reason to be skeptical. Those are pretty words, but what if I fail? What if the restaurant closes and all the employees lose their jobs and the community loses another gathering place? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her question seriously. Then we'll learn from the failure and try again. But Keisha, the alternative isn't safety. It's the continued exploitation of communities that deserve better. He gestured toward the Sterling Supper Club, where the lunch crowd was slowly dispersing. This restaurant survived for 23 years despite corrupt management. Imagine what it could become with ethical leadership and adequate resources. Through the window, Keisha could see Miguel in the kitchen, preparing orders with the same care and pride he'd shown every day for the past 3 years. She could see Jenny greeting regular customers by name, remembering their preferences and asking about their families. She could see the potential that Marcus was describing, the possibility of work that served something larger than mere survival. When do we start? We already have. Marcus handed her a business card with her name printed below the Sterling Community Kitchens logo. Welcome to the most important job you'll ever have. The business card felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained the weight of every dream Keisha had deferred and every compromise she'd made to survive. Keisha Davis, Chief Executive Officer, titles that had seemed impossible just days ago, now printed in elegant font on premium cardstock. The lawyers will have the partnership agreements ready by tomorrow, Marcus continued, but I wanted you to have something tangible, a reminder that this isn't just an idea anymore. Keisha studied the card, running her thumb over the raised lettering. What happens to the Sterling Supper Club? That depends on what you want to happen. The building lease runs through the end of the year, and the existing staff deserves notice before any major changes. Marcus leaned back in his chair. We could close it and transfer everyone to the Harlem location, or we could use it as a training facility for the Community Kitchens program. Training facility? Cooking classes for local residents, small business workshops, community meeting space. A way to give back to the neighborhood that supported you while you were figuring out your own path. Marcus gestured toward the dining room, where the afternoon shift was beginning. Miguel has amazing culinary skills but no formal training. Jenny understands customer service better than most hospitality school graduates. They could become instructors instead of just employees. The idea sparked something in Keisha's imagination. She could see the Sterling transformed into something entirely new, a place where people came not just to eat, but to learn, where the skills that kept communities alive were passed from one generation to the next. How long do we have to decide? Take your time. The Harlem location needs 3 weeks of renovation before we can open, so you'll have plenty of opportunity to think about the Sterling's future. Marcus stood and gathered his things. But first, we need to handle the immediate situation with Carl and the financial irregularities. Is he really going to cooperate? He doesn't have much choice. The evidence you documented is more than sufficient for criminal charges, and his intimidation attempts this morning only made things worse. Marcus's expression grew serious. The district attorney's office is very interested in financial crimes that target community organizations. They've agreed to reduce charges in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. Keisha felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. Carl had earned his consequences, but she knew that desperation often drove people to make terrible choices. What will happen to him? Probation, community service, permanent prohibition from financial management positions? He'll avoid prison, but his career in hospitality is over. Marcus paused at the door. Some bridges can't be rebuilt, Keisha. The important thing is learning to recognize them before you burn them. After Marcus left, Keisha sat alone in the restaurant, watching the familiar rhythm of the afternoon shift. In 3 weeks, she would be running her own restaurant, responsible for employees and customers and community relationships that extended far beyond taking orders and serving food. The magnitude of the change felt overwhelming, but underneath the anxiety was something else: excitement. For the first time in her adult life, she was moving towards something instead of just away from poverty. She was building instead of just surviving. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was work today, baby?" Keisha stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain that everything had changed. That her daughter, the waitress, was about to become her daughter, the CEO. That the medical bills and financial stress that had dominated their lives for years might finally be manageable. She typed back, "Big changes coming, Mama. Good changes. You get a promotion?" Something like that. 3 dots appeared as her mother typed, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "You be careful with changes, baby. Sometimes what looks good from a distance gets complicated up close." It was exactly the kind of wisdom that had kept her mother alive through decades of challenges, and exactly the kind of caution that Keisha would need to balance against the courage required to build something new. "I will, Mama, but sometimes staying still is more dangerous than moving forward. You sound like your father when he talks like that." Keisha smiled, remembering her father's favorite phrase: "Standing water gets stagnant. Moving water stays clean." He died before seeing any of his own dreams realized, but maybe his daughter could carry them forward in ways he'd never imagined. She looked around the Sterling Supper Club one more time, seeing it not as the place where her dreams had been deferred, but as the place where they had been tested and refined until they were strong enough to become reality. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and contracts and the hard work of turning possibility into practice. But tonight, she would call her mother and share the news that their long struggle was about to transform into something neither of them had dared to hope for. 3 weeks later, Keisha stood in the kitchen of Sterling Community Kitchen's flagship location, watching Miguel put the finishing touches on their opening night menu. The space was everything Marcus had promised: bright, modern, and designed for both efficiency and community. The open kitchen allowed diners to see their food being prepared, while flexible seating arrangements could accommodate everything from intimate dates to community meetings. "Nervous?" Miguel asked as he plated the signature dish they'd developed together. Soul food with a contemporary twist that honored traditional flavors while appealing to diverse palates. "Terrified," Keisha admitted, but the good kind of terrified. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of permits and inspections, staff training and menu development, community outreach and media interviews. Keisha had discovered that running a restaurant required skills she'd never realized she possessed: financial analysis, conflict resolution, public speaking, and the ability to make dozens of critical decisions every day. But she'd also discovered that years of survival had prepared her better than any business school could have. Understanding tight budgets helped her create efficient operations. Experience with difficult customers translated into effective conflict management. Most importantly, her genuine connection to the community they served gave every decision a clear purpose. The opening night guest list read like a cross-section of Harlem: long-time residents and newcomers, community leaders and local business owners, families who'd struggled with food insecurity, and young professionals looking for dining options that aligned with their values. Marcus had insisted on keeping the event small and authentic, rather than flashy and promotional. This isn't about impressing investors, he'd explained during the planning. It's about showing the community that we're here to serve them, not the other way around. Carl's case had been resolved the previous week with exactly the outcome Marcus had predicted: probation, restitution, and a permanent ban from financial management positions. But more importantly, the investigation had uncovered a network of similar fraud operations targeting small businesses throughout the city. Carl's cooperation had led to multiple arrests and the recovery of nearly $500,000 in stolen funds. "How started something bigger than you realized," the assistant district attorney had told Keisha during Carl's sentencing hearing. "Small-scale financial fraud often connects to larger criminal enterprises. Your willingness to come forward helped us identify patterns we'd been missing." Now, as the first guests began arriving for opening night, Keisha felt the full weight of what they'd built. Sterling Community Kitchens wasn't just a restaurant. It was a model for how business could serve community instead of exploiting it. The menu featured locally sourced ingredients purchased at fair prices from neighborhood vendors. The staff included several employees from the old Sterling Supper Club, all earning wages that reflected the restaurant's actual revenue rather than Carl's skimmed version. But the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead, as they proved that ethical business practices could coexist with financial sustainability. "Keisha." Jenny appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face glowing with excitement. "Mrs. Chen is here with a group from the Seniors Center, and they're asking for you specifically." Keisha smoothed her chef's coat, still strange to think of herself as someone who wore chef's coats, and walked into the dining room. Mrs. Chen stood near the entrance with 6 other elderly residents, all dressed in their best clothes for the occasion. "We wanted to be your first customers," Mrs. Chen explained, embracing Keisha warmly. "After what you did, exposing that fraud at the old place, we knew you were someone who cared about community." "I hope we can earn your trust," Keisha replied, leading them to a round table by the window. "We're committed to fair pricing and honest service." "Honey," Mrs. Chen said with a smile, "you already earned our trust. Now you just have to earn our repeat business." As the evening progressed, Keisha moved between the kitchen and dining room, greeting guests and ensuring that every detail met their carefully established standards. She watched families sharing meals they could actually afford, saw young professionals discovering that ethical dining didn't mean compromising on quality, observed community leaders discussing partnerships and collaboration over dessert. This was what success looked like, not just profit margins and review ratings, but relationships built on mutual respect and shared investment in community well-being. At the end of the night, as the last guests departed and the staff cleaned up, Marcus appeared in the kitchen with a bottle of champagne and a serious expression. "We need to talk," he said, "about expansion." "Expansion?" Keisha set down the inventory clipboard she'd been reviewing, her mind already racing through the implications. They'd been open for exactly 6 hours, and Marcus was already thinking about growth. "Sit down," Marcus said, pouring champagne into 2 coffee cups, the only clean glasses remaining after the opening night celebration. "Tonight exceeded every projection we'd made. We served 120 people, had a 40-minute wait time, and received 17 inquiries about catering services." Keisha accepted the cup, trying to process the numbers. "That's good, right?" "That's extraordinary. Most restaurants consider themselves successful if they're 70% full on opening night. We were at capacity with a waiting list." Marcus pulled out his tablet, showing her real-time analytics from their point-of-sale system. "But more importantly, the customer feedback is exactly what we hoped for. People understand that they're not just buying dinner, they're investing in a business model that serves their community." The data showed not just sales figures, but customer engagement metrics that validated their entire approach. Average table time was longer than typical restaurants, suggesting that people were treating Sterling Community Kitchens as a gathering place rather than just a dining destination. Customers had photographed and shared their meals on social media, not because the food was trendy, but because they wanted to promote a business they believed in. "So what kind of expansion are you thinking?" 3 more locations over the next 18 months, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, each one adapted to its specific community, but following the same core principles. Marcus scrolled through property listings and demographic analyses. We've already received inquiries from community development organizations in all 3 boroughs. Keisha felt simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. That's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of opportunity, but only if you're ready to think beyond operational management into strategic leadership. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. This isn't just about restaurants anymore, Keisha. Sterling Community Kitchens is becoming a model for community-centered business development. Other entrepreneurs are already asking how to replicate our approach in different industries. What do you mean? Grocery stores, laundromats, childcare centers, any service business can apply these principles. Fair wages, community investment, transparent pricing, local sourcing. Marcus gestured toward the dining room where staff members were resetting tables for tomorrow's lunch service. What we've built here proves that ethical business practices don't require sacrificing profitability. The scope of what he was describing felt enormous. You're talking about changing how business works in entire neighborhoods. I'm talking about giving communities alternatives to exploitation. When businesses serve residents instead of extracting from them, entire economic ecosystems become healthier. Marcus pulled up a presentation that looked like it belonged in a university economics course. Locally owned businesses recirculate money within communities. Fair wages increase purchasing power. Transparent practices build trust that extends beyond individual transactions. This is incredible. If you believe communities deserve businesses that serve them instead of extracting from them, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what kind of community-focused business you'd want to see in your neighborhood. Keisha studied the presentation, seeing her own neighborhood experiences reflected in academic language and statistical analysis. This is what you meant when you said we were building something important. This is what happens when moral courage meets business acumen. You didn't just expose Carl's fraud. You demonstrated that there was a better way to run the Sterling. Now we're proving that better way can be scaled and sustained. Marcus closed the tablet and looked at her directly. The question is whether you're ready to become the face of a movement. Movement? Community-centered business development. There are already articles being written about Sterling Community Kitchens, speaking requests coming in, and venture capital firms asking about investment opportunities. Marcus paused. Not that we need their money, but their interest proves that people recognize the significance of what you've built. Keisha felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. A month ago, she'd been serving tables and struggling to pay her mother's medical bills. Now she was apparently leading a movement that could transform how businesses operated in underserved communities. What would expansion actually look like? Practically, I mean. You'd become the CEO of Sterling Community Kitchens Corporate, with general managers running individual locations under your oversight. Your role would shift from day-to-day operations to strategic planning, staff development, and community partnership building. Marcus pulled out a contract from his briefcase. It would also mean a significant increase in your ownership stake and compensation. The contract outlined terms that made Keisha's head spin: base salary, profit sharing, equity participation, and benefits that included healthcare for her entire family. It was more financial security than she'd imagined possible, compensation that reflected the value she was creating rather than just the hours she worked. Take your time reviewing this, Marcus said. But I wanted you to see the trajectory we're discussing. This isn't just about running restaurants. It's about pioneering a new model for community development. As Marcus left to handle some administrative details, Keisha walked through the empty dining room, straightening chairs and wiping down tables that didn't need cleaning. The familiar motions helped her process the enormity of what was being offered. Through the windows, she could see Harlem settling into its evening rhythm. Families walking home from late shifts, teenagers gathered outside the corner store, elderly residents sitting on stoops and watching the neighborhood's nightly ballet. These were the people Sterling Community Kitchens existed to serve, and their support had made tonight's success possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Saw the news trucks outside earlier. We famous now? She smiled and typed back, We're important now, different thing. But as she looked at the contract Marcus had left behind, she realized that fame and importance might be inseparable. If Sterling Community Kitchens became a model for other communities, if their approach influenced how businesses operated throughout the city, then her face and story would become symbols of something much larger than personal success. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. She'd spent most of her life trying to remain invisible, to avoid the kind of attention that made survival more difficult. Now she was being asked to step into the spotlight and advocate for changes that would challenge powerful interests. Her phone rang. Her mother's voice was warm but concerned. "Baby, Mrs. Rodriguez saw you on the news. Said you opened some fancy restaurant and they were calling you a CEO. That true?" "It's true, Mama." "Well, damn." A long pause. "You sure you know what you're doing?" Keisha looked around the restaurant, at the evidence of what community support and ethical business practices could create when combined with adequate resources and unwavering commitment to principle. "I'm sure I know what I'm trying to do," she said. "Whether I know how to do it, and I guess we'll find out together. That's all any of us can do, baby. Try our best and hope it's enough." After hanging up, Keisha sat alone in the restaurant that represented everything she'd worked toward and everything she was being asked to risk. The decision about expansion would determine not just her own future, but the future of a business model that could serve communities throughout the city. But that decision could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she would celebrate the fact that a waitress who'd saved a stranger's life had somehow become someone capable of saving entire neighborhoods. 1 year later, Keisha stood on the stage of the Apollo Theater, looking out at an audience that represented every neighborhood Sterling Community Kitchens had touched. The occasion was the Community Business Leadership Awards, and she was receiving recognition not just for building successful restaurants, but for pioneering an approach to economic development that other cities were beginning to adopt. "When I was working 3 jobs just to keep my family afloat," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the historic venue, "I never imagined that helping a stranger in a car accident would lead to this moment. But that's the thing about community. You never know when a single act of decency will create ripples that change everything." In the audience, she could see Marcus beaming with pride, Mrs. Chen dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Miguel wearing the chef's coat of the newest Sterling Community Kitchen location in the Bronx. Her mother sat in the front row, resplendent in a new dress and finally free from the financial stress that had dominated their lives for so long. The past year had brought challenges she couldn't have anticipated: navigating city bureaucracy, managing rapid growth, dealing with competitors who tried to copy their model without understanding their values. But it had also brought successes that validated every risk they'd taken. Sterling Community Kitchens now operated 4 locations, each serving its neighborhood, while contributing to a network that supported local suppliers, trained young entrepreneurs, and demonstrated that businesses could thrive by serving communities rather than exploiting them. The original Sterling Supper Club had been transformed into a culinary training center that graduated its first class of community chefs the previous month. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the numbers, impressive as they were. It was in the stories. The single mother who'd been promoted from server to general manager and was now saving for her own home. The teenager who'd discovered a passion for cooking and earned a scholarship to culinary school. The elderly residents who'd found not just affordable meals, but a gathering place where they were valued and respected. "People ask me what the secret is," Keisha continued. "How we built something that serves both profit and purpose. The secret is simple. When you treat people with dignity and respect, when you price fairly and pay honestly, when you invest in community instead of extracting from it, you create something sustainable, something worth fighting for." The applause was thunderous, but Keisha was thinking about the conversation she'd had with Marcus earlier that day. Other cities were offering partnership opportunities, asking Sterling Community Kitchens to help replicate their model in Detroit, Atlanta, Oakland. The potential for impact was enormous, but so was the responsibility. "Tonight isn't about celebrating what we've accomplished," she said as the applause died down. "It's about committing to what we'll build next, because every community deserves businesses that serve them. Every worker deserves wages that allow dignity. Every neighborhood deserves economic development that strengthens rather than displaces." After the ceremony, as Keisha mingled with community leaders and social entrepreneurs, she felt the weight of what they'd created and the promise of what was still possible. The scared waitress who'd risked her job to expose fraud had become someone capable of influencing policy and inspiring others to demand better from their business communities. Marcus appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "Any regrets?" Keisha thought about the question seriously. The past year had been exhausting, stressful, and frequently overwhelming. She'd made mistakes, faced criticism, and dealt with pressures she'd never experienced. But she'd also discovered capabilities she'd never imagined, built relationships that enriched her life, and created something that would outlast her own involvement. "Ask me again in 10 years, she said, clinking her glass against his. "When we've opened in every city that needs us. Every city needs us. Then we better get started." Outside the Apollo, Harlem hummed with its usual energy. But now, scattered throughout the neighborhood, were signs of what happened when business and community worked together. Sterling community kitchen locations that served as gathering places, training centers that prepared residents for careers in hospitality, supplier relationships that kept money circulating locally instead of flowing to distant corporate headquarters. It wasn't perfect. No single business model could solve all the challenges facing urban communities, but it was a beginning, a proof of concept that could inspire others to build something better. As Keisha walked through the neighborhood where it all started, she passed the spot where she'd pulled Marcus from his wrecked BMW. A simple act of human decency on a rainy night had somehow grown into a movement that was changing how business worked in communities throughout the city. She smiled, remembering her father's favorite saying, "Moving water stays clean." They'd built something that kept moving, kept growing, kept serving the communities that had supported them from the beginning. And they were just getting started. If Keisha's journey from waitress to CEO inspired you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share in the comments, what act of kindness have you witnessed that created unexpected consequences? Your story might be featured in our next video. Remember, every community deserves businesses that serve them instead of exploiting them. Every worker deserves dignity. Every dream deferred is not a dream denied. Until next time, keep moving forward. The water stays cleanest when it flows.